Good morning. I'm glad to see you. Didn't expect to see you, but I'm glad to see you this morning. I did not have plans to be here. We actually expected to be in Mexico, and as you know, that did not turn out with respect to the two of us, Luann and I. Luann is at home. She is no longer in the hospital. They did a fairly extensive battery of tests this past week and told us what it's not. Still have no idea what we are dealing with. She is not feeling well, but at least we know what we're not dealing with. So I suppose that's progress of a sort. I do appreciate you keeping her in your prayers. Do keep in your prayers also our folks who are in Mexico. Brother Zach Roberson, the preacher from Middle Fayette, was very kind to step in at the last minute in terms of preparing lessons to preach in my absence there in Oquiltzapotlan. So we anticipate good results from the work there, and pray for safety, certainly for everybody involved. I don't know of any other announcements that need to be mentioned at the moment. I'm a little bit out of the loop anyway. So if you would, take your Bible and turn to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6. And I thought we would deal with a question this morning that's maybe a little bit esoteric in one sense. Its roots lie in a statement in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4. And if my little screen will cooperate, there we go. In Genesis chapter 6 and verse 4, we read, "There were," depending on the translation from which you're reading, "giants on the earth in those days. When the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." Giants. Now, if you have a modern speech translation, English Standard, I didn't think to check the New King James, but certainly the Revised Standard and NIV, the New American Standard, most modern speech translations will use a word there that is perhaps not very familiar to us, and that word is Nephilim, Nephilim. There were Nephilim, and that's a plural word in the land in those days, but the older translations use the word giants. It's interesting that in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the Greek word that's used here is the word gigantes, gigantics, giants. Where did giants come from? Well, what is one common explanation offered in Christendom, not the Lord's church, but Christendom generally? Exactly. They read this statement in Genesis 6 and verse 4. There were giants in the land, on the earth, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. Who were the sons of God? Say again? Okay, offspring of Adam. In point of fact, you are correct. The offspring of Adam. Who would be the offspring of Adam? Well, we know Cain and Abel. We don't know whether Abel had any children or not before Cain murdered him, but then there's Seth and subsequent sons and daughters. What do we know about the offspring of Adam? They're ordinary mortal men, just like we are. Ordinary mortal people, men and women. Normal human beings. However, another commonly held view on this question. Where did giants come from? Who were the sons of God and the daughters of men? Sons of God plus daughters of men equals giants in this line of thinking. And the explanation, well, what's the distinction here? Sons of God, one common belief. Oh, we're talking about angels. And when you look at Jude verse 6, I started to say chapter 1, but there is only one chapter. What do you read in Jude verse 6? Well, angels who did not keep their proper abode or their proper domain, but left their own abode, He has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the day of judgment of the great day, for the judgment of the great day, rather. Angels who did not stay in their proper place is how that usually is read. Okay, what does that have to do with giants? The line of thinking goes something like this. You read Genesis 6 and verse 4, the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and then you go over and you puzzle over that as you're reading through the Bible until you come to Jude verse 6. Aha! Angels who did not keep their proper domain, who didn't stay in their lane. So, sons of God plus daughters of men equals giants. Wait, sons of God, well, that must refer to angels, goes this line of thinking. So, you have angels intermarrying with human women and producing giants. That's the line of thinking. However, notice what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 30. He said there, in response to a convoluted question from the Sadducees about marriage and the resurrection, Sadducees did not believe in what? Sadducees did not believe in life after life. They did not believe in the resurrection. They believed that when you die, you're dead all over, just like Rover the dog. All right? Long, involved, convoluted story. A woman marries a man and his 6 brothers in turn. According to the Levirate law, no offspring. They all die. Okay, Mr. Rabbi Jesus, Mr. Big Shot Scholar, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Ha, 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 ha. And what did Jesus say in Matthew 22? You do err not knowing the Scriptures. You've made a mistake because you're ignorant of both God's Word and God's power, verse 29. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are what? As the angels, like angels of God in heaven. Angels don't marry. There are no angelic wedding ceremonies. Well, nothing in the Bible speaks of angels reproducing. Where did angels come from? As far as we know, God made them. Nothing in the Bible speaks of angels mating with human women. Nothing in the Bible even suggests that they have such abilities. And if it did, what business is it of ours? If they did, what business is it of ours? Not our business. So, go over to Hebrews chapter 1 and just notice there in chapter 1, verses 13 and 14, something that the Hebrews writer tells us, and I don't believe we have a slide for this one, so you'll actually have to use your Bible. But in Hebrews chapter 1, as we have the introduction to this letter, the inspired writer tells us something about the purpose of angels. After he has emphasized that Jesus is the Son of God, he then asks a question. To which of the angels has he, God the Father, ever said, "Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? Well, that's a rhetorical question. Any good Jew or Hebrew would know the answer to that question. God never said that to any of the angels. Why not? Verse 14. Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who inherit salvation? Angels, though we have biblical precedent for them to appear in corporeal form, we have biblical precedent, for example, in Genesis with Abraham and with Lot being warned to flee from Sodom and so forth. We do have examples where angels appeared in what we would recognize as human form or physical form. How are angels generically described? Serving spirits. Where are angels found? In the presence of God, in heaven. And those whom he dispatches, coming and going according to his will. And, go back to Jude verse 6, those who did not keep their proper domain, their proper abode, what do we find out about them? God has reserved them for judgment. There is nothing in the Scriptures that suggests that rogue angels are allowed to roam the world at will. Satan is in the world, and he has his servants who are at times called angels, 2 Corinthians. But what does the word angel mean? Messenger, in the sense of one being sent. Let me ask you a question. We talk about the ministering servants of Satan. His ministers make themselves angels of light, as Paul says. Would it be inaccurate to describe one who promotes atheism, for example, as being a servant, whether knowingly or not, of Satan? Why not? He's promoting Satan's ends. Carl Sagan was one of the most recognizable faces of scientific inquiry in the previous generation. Enormously intelligent man, educated, degreed, respected, honored, and at best, a skeptic with respect to the existence of God. A promoter of doctrines and ideas that are antithetical to the gospel of Christ. Was he a knowing, willing servant of the ends of Satan, the goals, the purposes of Satan? I don't see anything in his life or writings or teaching or speech that suggests that. But did the ideas that he espoused promote that attitude and that goal? Even indirectly, certainly. Was he recognized as authoritative, as an honorable man in the world at large? Yeah. Oh, he had degrees. He was qualified, but he was not competent because he refused. He was not incapable. He was unwilling to consider all of the evidence. A number of years ago, I believe this was back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, he actually issued a public challenge for, as he would have expressed it, any reputable creationist or Christian apologist to meet him in public debate. A challenge which was almost instantaneously answered by Thomas B. Warren, holder of a degree in apologetics from Vanderbilt University, a PhD no less, who was in his turn utterly ignored by Sagan because, why? This person is not credible. Now, mind you, Warren debated men like Warren Mattson, Anthony G. Flew, some of the foremost world-recognized advocates of atheism in that generation. Men who were every bit the equal, if not the superior, of Sagan. Oh, he was not credible. That was the excuse for ignoring the response. Angels, ministering spirits. That's their lane in creation. Now, what is a giant? Someone define a giant for me? Okay, Sally says someone with abnormal growth genes. Okay, that's a pretty reasonable, functional description. We say giant because this person is not average. In 1940, before the United States was actively involved in World War II, Great Britain, particularly England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, were involved in conflict with Nazi Germany. After December 1941, they were also involved in conflict with Imperial Japan. The average British Tommy, the average British soldier, 1940. Anybody have any idea how big he was? Pretty small. You're right, Hugh. The average British soldier's height in World War II was less than 5 feet 4 inches tall. For reference, if I could pick one of you, Miss Sally, how tall are you? 5'1". The average British soldier was 3 inches taller than Miss Sally. The average, the typical. Now, my driver's license says that I'm 6 feet 4 inches tall. I'm probably not quite that tall because there's about 100 pounds around my middle pulling me down now. And you get older, your bones compress and so forth. I'm probably about 5'2.5". But still, I'm most of a foot taller than average for that. In 1980, we had the opportunity to tour the Tower of London, the Tower Museum. Lou Ann and I did. And amongst other things, there's all kinds of medieval armament and so forth. And here is a suit of armor that belonged to Henry VIII. I'm Henry VIII, I am. That Henry. 6 wives. Looking at that armor was instructive because it was just about my size. He was an extraordinarily large man for the 1500s. Head and shoulders bigger than the average Englishman. The average girl's height in North Georgia in the 1930s, based on exhibits at Berry College and their little museum, about 5 feet tall. The average girl in the 1930s in North Georgia was actually shorter than Miss Sally. Her average waist size was about 20 inches. I can almost put my hands around that. On the other hand, the Dinka people of East Africa, as a group, as an ethnic group, they are the average tallest people in the world. Taking them into account as a group, this would include men and women. The average height of a typical Dinka tribesperson is 5 feet and just a smidge under 10 inches. The average. That means there's a whole lot of people a lot taller than that. Anybody ever heard of Robert Wadlow, the Alton giant? Robert Wadlow died at 22 years of age, born in Alton, Illinois, right around the turn of the 20th century. Robert Wadlow was the tallest person in modern human history. His pituitary gland was out of control, and he grew to be 8 feet 11 inches tall. The ceiling height of an average residential room in a typical suburban house today is 8 feet. That would put his entire head stuck up in the ceiling. I can reach up and just on tippy toes touch an 8-foot ceiling. I couldn't even get to his ears. Now, what does all that have to do with Genesis 6, verse 4, and there were giants in the earth in those days? Well, the word giant appears 11 times in the King James Version. All in the Old Testament, all in the first 6, 7 books of the Old Testament. And there are two Hebrew words that are translated by the English word giant. One of them is the word Nephil or Nephilim, which is the plural. And it appears 3 times in the book of Genesis and in the book of Numbers. Nephilim. The other Hebrew word that is translated by the word giant is the root word Rapha, or Rephaim, plural. And it appears 8 more times in the book of Deuteronomy and in the book of Joshua. And these are the words that are used to describe, among others, the people of the land of Canaan. In the book of Numbers, when spies are sent to spy out the land the first time, Numbers chapter 13 thereabouts, they come back and what's the report of the 12 spies? It's a good land, it flows with milk and honey, and what? We're like grasshoppers compared to the giants, the Nephilim, who are there. Get over to the book of Deuteronomy, and Moses uses a different word, Rephaim, that's also translated giants to describe the same people. Now here's something to notice. Neither one of those words is ever applied in the scriptures to angels. Those are not words that have anything to do with angels. There is another word in the Old Testament. 9 times we run across the word Anakim. The Anakims. Now these are the sons or the descendants of Anak, who was a king. And this word literally means long-necked. The long-necked ones. And the word Anak, actually the root of it has to do with necklaces or pendants, things that would hang around the neck. But it's also a word that is never used in the scriptures to describe angels. Well, what about Goliath? You look at 1 Samuel chapter 17, and in verse 4, we're introduced to a soldier, a champion of the Philistine army from the city or the town of Gath, and his name is Goliath. And he's described as what? We talk about him as a giant. He's described as being 6.5 cubits tall. What's a cubit? Exactly. A cubit is an ancient measure, a unit of measure. It's typically described as being approximately the distance from the bend or the crook of the elbow to the middle finger of the hand. On an average modern man, that's about 18 inches. So 6.5 cubits. Goliath was 9 feet 6 inches tall. Well, consider a couple of points. Number one, there is the cubit, but there's also in ancient literature mention of the royal cubit, which is considered to be somewhat longer than the cubit. And archaeologists and so forth tell us, oh, that would be about 21 inches long. Oh, so now we're talking about a giant over 10 feet tall if we're using royal cubits. However, when we talk about a cubit, unit of measure, crook of the arm, tip of the middle finger, what was the size of the average individual, average man in the ancient world? Archaeologists tell us that ancient soldiers, for example, had a lot more in common stature-wise with World War II Brits than they did with World War II Americans or even Germans. On the other hand, the average Japanese soldier in World War II was right at, or maybe even slightly under, 5 feet tall. How long are the arms of a 5 foot 4 inch man versus the arms of a 6 foot 4 inch man? Maybe 8 inches different. Well, I don't know if it's 8, but it's several. If I could borrow an example, Brother David, how tall are you? 5'9". How long is your sleeve? If you buy a shirt or a coat that's sized, that's 8. Surely not. Sleeve is usually double what the neck size is. What's your neck size? Okay, so 32 inches for a sleeve, not for a neck. I had a neighbor when we grew up. Some of you would know his name. He wrestled professionally under the stage name Ivan Putski. My wife went to school with his son. They lived down the street from us when I was a kid. We used to refer to him as no neck, not the son, but the father, because his neck was about the same size as his head. David is 5'9", wears a 32-inch sleeve. I'm 6 feet and some. I wear a 37-inch sleeve. 36 I can get away with. 4 inches difference in the length of our arms, which would make the difference from the crook of the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, roughly speaking, 2 inches different just between me and David Poskovich. And we even share the same name. But there's a significant difference there. Take a man who is 5 feet tall, and let's guesstimate the length of the crook of the elbow to the tip of the middle finger. If it's 18 inches for a man over 6 feet tall, and 16 to 17 inches for a man close to 6 feet tall, it would be more like 14, 15 inches for a man who's 5 feet tall. Suddenly, we're not talking about 9 pushing 10 feet tall for Goliath, but what? 6.5 cubits, if we're talking about 15 inches, is now more in the 7 foot plus range. How tall is Shaquille O'Neal? He's pretty tall. Isaiah Thomas? Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? Bao Jishun, whatever his name is, he's currently the tallest man in the world. He's 8 feet 2 inches tall. Here's the point. We go to Numbers chapter 13, and we look at verse 33, and we read the report that the spies brought back about the people of the land of Canaan. It's a good land, a land that flows with milk and honey. You know, we brought back this evidence of it, and what was their assessment of it? Faithless individuals, 10 of them versus Joshua and Caleb. There's no way we can do this. At verse 32, they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, the land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of what? Great height, the English Standard Version says. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, or the giants, in the King James Version. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers in their sight. Here's the point. Giants are grasshoppers. We seemed like, we appeared like, we were as grasshoppers compared to them. August of 1980, Luann and I had the opportunity to spend a week with a group of folks conducting an evangelistic campaign in a little town just outside of Belfast, Northern Ireland, a place called Bangor, B-A-N-G-O-R, like Bangor, Maine, but it's Bangor, Northern Ireland. And we spent Sunday afternoon through Thursday afternoon walking through the town, knocking doors and inviting people to come to the Hamilton House, which was a public hall, to hear the gospel preached, to help encourage and build up the local church there. There's been a congregation there for many, many years. It's not large, but it's there. One of my instructors from Bible school was the preacher for the campaign. And John and I see eye to eye physically. We're the same height. Now, in 1980, I was close to 100 pounds lighter, so I was a good bit thinner. 195 pounds of spring steel. John at that point was probably about 310 pounds. He's a large man. Jovial, easygoing, immensely talented Bible student. Great teacher. I think it was Wednesday morning. We came back in from having knocked doors through that morning. It rained every day that we were there. You ever want to break in a pair of brand new leather shoes that kind of hurt your feet? Walk in them in the water until they're sopping wet through and wear them until they're dry day after day for a week, and I promise they'll be the most comfortable shoes you ever own. But we came back in for lunch, and John and the brother who'd been walking with him that morning just laughing and having a good time. And almost the last door that they had knocked on that morning before they returned for lunch, John walked up to the door of this little flat in a housing estate, and he knocked on the door, and this wee little Irish woman, about 4 feet 9 inches tall, came to the door and lifted the shade of the window just enough to see out, and behind the door, which never opened, they heard the woman shriek, "Ah! A giant!" And the shade dropped, and they heard rapid little steps back to the back of the apartment. John was standing there at the door, taking up all the sunlight, I guess. She wanted nothing to do with that giant American. John is my size. Not very many people in this world would describe me as a giant. A little big, maybe. But then again, to me, this is normal. If you're smaller than me, then you're small. I'm not big, you're small. The average British Tommy, as we said, World War II, was about 5 feet 4 inches tall. The average American G.I. Joe in World War II, the average was 5'8" and some, pushing 5'9". You remember, some of you are old enough to remember what was said about Americans in Britain during the war. They have 3 problems. They're overpaid, over what, and over here. Well, they were also oversized compared to their English counterparts. The perception is that the average American was huge. The biggest, not necessarily the tallest, but the biggest people in the world in the 21st century on average, that includes both height and girth, are the Dutch. It may be it's probably fast becoming a politically incorrect term now. But very small people, not little people, not midgets or dwarfs. I realize those are politically impolite terms now. But those speak to a particular body proportion. We're not talking about that. We're talking about very, very small people. Folks that used to be described as pygmies. People living in hinterlands of undeveloped countries. Very, very small, but proportional to much larger people. How would a modern pygmy describe an average Dutchman today? Giants. Giants. Where did giants come from? Well, God created them. Perfectly normal people. Abraham Lincoln debated Stephen Douglas in a series of debates in the 1850s, contending for a seat in the United States Senate. And so famous were their series of debates that now collegiate debaters engage in what are sometimes described as Lincoln-Douglas debates, and there are rules about them. And Stephen Douglas, famous as an orator and speaker, was known as the Little Giant and was fully expected to just slay Goliath Lincoln on the platform. And instead, even though Douglas was elected to the Senate, Lincoln was then elected president. And the consensus outcome of those debates was that even though Douglas won the election, Lincoln won the debates. Stephen Douglas was about this tall. Abraham Lincoln was about this tall. It's a matter of perception. Giant in the scriptures is a way of describing perception or perspective more than physical stature. Now, physical stature, yes, Goliath was a large man. I have no doubt that Goliath was fully, probably pushing 8 feet tall. Whereas David is described as small and ruddy, small and red. He's probably an average, maybe even a slightly below average size Jew. The comparison between the two would have been a little bit like Lincoln and Douglas. But here's the point. When the scripture speaks of giants, it's describing things from a human perspective. It's describing things in a way that we can relate to. It's not describing individuals who are some hybrid of angels and humans or something of that sort. It's describing uncommonly large, but ordinary human beings. After all, remember what happened between David and Goliath. David took him down. Or as the old expression sometimes says, it's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. Thank you for your attention. Appreciate very much your bearing with me through this, and hope that's helpful and useful to you in some way.